In every gilded palace, behind every royal portrait, there's a woman history tried to silence with a crown. But some queens didn't behave. They gambled, schemed, seduced, ruled, and refused to smile politely while doing it. This isn't the story of grace and tiaras, it's the other side of the throne. From poison-laced politics to velvet-cloaked vengeance, these are the 30 most scandalous, unruly, and unapologetically vulgar queens in history. Brace yourself, because royalty has never been this unfiltered. Before we dive in, if scandal, history, and a touch of royal chaos is your kind of thing, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? We're building a global court of night owls, insomniacs, and history lovers. Let's see who's out there. 1. Joanna the Second of Naples. Joanna the Second of Naples was the kind of queen who made 15th century Europe clutch its rosaries a little tighter. Born into power, raised on palace intrigue, and seemingly allergic to anything resembling moral restraint, Joanna ruled Naples from 1414 to 1435 like a woman auditioning for the role of history's most unpredictable monarch, and maybe history's most theatrical one. She ascended the throne at the ripe age of 41, unmarried, childless, and already a widow. That alone was enough to make the royal gossip circuits hyperventilate. But Joanna didn't just rule. She performed monarchy like it was an opera, full of costume changes, dramatic exits, passionate arias, and the occasional whispered disappearance of a lover who knew too much, or too little, depending on which rumour you preferred. Now, let's be clear. The archives are messy. The stories about her rotating carousel of lovers, some allegedly yanked straight from the streets of Naples, others from the noble houses of Europe, are difficult to verify with total precision. But that's not really the point, is it? History doesn't always run on facts. It runs on whispers, letters, pamphlets, and the anxious scrawl of papal advisors trying to explain why the Queen of Naples had just elevated her stable boy to the position of Grand Chamberlain. His name was Sergiani Caracciolo, a man who went from fetching horses to pulling the strings of the kingdom, all because Joanna found him interesting. In the beginning, he was charming, sharp, obedient. By the end, he was powerful, arrogant, and widely hated. He built a fortune in her shadow, commanded armies in her name, and was allegedly involved in deals with foreign powers that she may or may not have sanctioned. The church naturally loathed him. Nobles feared him. Joanna, for a time, adored him, until she didn't. One day in 1432, Sergiani was mysteriously found stabbed to death in his bed, killed by persons unknown, though everyone knew exactly who'd ordered it. The Queen, having decided she was done with his particular brand of ambition, had allegedly arranged for him to be removed in the most medieval way possible. 36 stabs, just to be sure. Like any good royal mystery, the official inquiry found nothing. Case closed. But Sergiani was just one name in a long and theatrical list. According to some chroniclers, Joanna had secret passageways built into her palace, a private labyrinth of decadence where lovers came in through trapdoors and, depending on her mood, sometimes left through them too. These could be exaggerations, of course, or they could be metaphors. Either way, the legend stuck. It always does when a woman in power refuses to play by the rules. And that was Joanna's greatest scandal. Not the lovers, not the deaths, not the court's endless string of financial and diplomatic disasters. It was her refusal to be tamed. She wielded sex, rumor, and chaos like they were royal regalia and governed with the strange theatrical volatility of a woman who had decided that no man, alive or stabbed, would rule her kingdom through her. Her people feared her. Her nobles resented her. The church wanted her gone. But history couldn't look away, and as it turned out, neither could her enemies, who kept underestimating her and often ended up either dead, disgraced, or exiled. Now you'd think that kind of ruthless charisma would be rare in queens. You'd be wrong, because our next royal didn't just inspire scandal, she engineered it. with lipstick, poison, and politics. 2. Catherine de Medici. Catherine de Medici never had the luxury of being ordinary. Born into the most powerful banking family in Renaissance Italy and married into the French crown, she carried a bloodline thicker than politics and a reputation more toxic than any poison her enemies accused her of using. If Joanna of Naples was chaos incarnate, Catherine was something colder, more calculating, the kind of queen who didn't need to shout scandal. She whispered it into law. Catherine's legend begins in the shadows of suspicion and rarely steps into the light. As a young girl, she was a political pawn, a Medici orphan sent to France to marry Henry II, a prince who was far more interested in his older mistress, Diane de Poitiers, than his young Florentine bride. Court life wasn't kind to Catherine. She was mocked for her Italian accent, dismissed as infertile, and sidelined in every meaningful way, until her husband's untimely death turned her into the most powerful woman in France. That's when the stories begin to curdle. At the heart of her mythos lies a group known as the L'escadron Volant, or the Flying Squadron, a supposed elite circle of beautiful female spies handpicked by Catherine to seduce powerful men, extract secrets, and control the court through soft whispers and soft sheets. The very idea of this glamorous cabal was irresistible to her enemies. A queen using sexuality not for pleasure, but for politics, scandalous, almost literary. Was it true? Hard to say. Protestant pamphleteers during the wars of religion had every reason to invent such tales. Catherine was Catholic, Italian, and a mother to kings. She was also blamed, rather conveniently, for every bad omen and diplomatic disaster that fell upon France. Poisoned chalices? Catherine. Dead ambassadors? Catherine. Star-crossed weddings turned massacres? Catherine. Ah yes, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In 1572, a royal wedding meant to unite Protestants and Catholics exploded into 6 days of slaughter, with thousands dead across France. Was Catherine behind it? Some say yes. Others say she merely lost control. But in the public imagination, she was always the mastermind, a widow in black, pacing the palace halls while her enemies bled in the streets. And then there's the art of the rumour itself. Catherine was accused of owning a secret chamber filled with poisons and magical devices. She was rumoured to consult astrologers, to host dark masses, to commission aphrodisiacs and venom in equal measure. Her love of Italian alchemy and Renaissance occultism was spun into something monstrous, because a woman with power and books was always easier to frame as a witch than a strategist. But make no mistake, Catherine didn't just survive her era, she defined it. She ruled through her sons, manipulated alliances and used fear like a fan, fluttering it just enough to make courtiers sweat. She played a long, bloody chess game against enemies who believed a woman couldn't possibly be pulling the strings, until they realized the strings were wrapped around their throats. And through it all, she kept her composure. No fiery speeches, no public breakdowns, just a widow in widow's black, outliving her enemies and attending the funerals of kings she had once raised. Catherine de Medici scandalized France, not with nudity or vulgarity, but with her refusal to be ornamental. In a world that wanted her decorative, she became dangerous. But if Catherine corrupted from behind the curtain, our next queen stepped into the spotlight, powdered and perfumed, with a smile that made revolutions inevitable. If you're still here after Catherine de Medici and her poison-laced politics, you're clearly one of us. Dark history, sharp queens, no apologies. So go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight, 3 a.m? Let's see which corner of the world is wide awake with scandal. 3. Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette didn't invent vulgarity. She merely wore it like silk. When she first arrived in France at 14, Austrian accent and all, Versailles found her charming, fragile, and delightfully foreign. By the time she was 30, those same courtiers were calling her a monster in pearls. Somewhere between her coronation and her decapitation, she became less of a queen and more of a rumour, a human mirror for everything the French loathed about their own excess. She was accused of everything: extravagance, arrogance, sexual frivolity, political ignorance, and of course that apocryphal line, "Let them eat cake." She probably never said it, but it fit the narrative so well that truth didn't matter. She was young, wealthy, frivolous, and foreign. To the starving Parisian, she may as well have been the devil in diamonds. But the real scandal of Marie Antoinette wasn't just her rumoured debauchery. It was her performance of pleasure in a time of hunger. She played queen like a girl playing house, except the furniture was gold and the rent was paid in blood taxes. While her subjects fought for bread, Marie played shepherdess in her private fantasy land, the Petit Trianon. There, dressed in linen gowns and straw hats, she frolicked with courtiers among fake cottages and perfumed sheep. It was a strange pastoral theatre of wealth, a fantasy of simplicity built at the cost of the real thing. The court gossiped relentlessly. Pamphlets accused her of every form of indulgence imaginable: gambling, flirtations, cross-dressing balls, and love affairs both real and invented. The most infamous scandal, the diamond necklace affair, wasn't even her doing. A con artist forged her name to acquire an extravagant necklace worth more than some small kingdoms, and when the fraud unravelled, the public decided the Queen must have been in on it. Truth became irrelevant. The optics were enough. Even her body became propaganda. Revolutionary pamphlets drew her as Medusa, as a serpent, as a devourer of France. In a world where kings were divine, queens were easy scapegoats, especially when they looked too serene while everything burned. Behind the image, however, Marie was less a temptress than a trapped adolescent in pearls. She was a political hostage caught between empires, married to a king who preferred locks and keys to human connection, and mother to children born into the shadow of a crumbling world. Her alleged vulgarity was less about moral corruption and more about defiance, an attempt to find pleasure in a life built on ceremony and surveillance. Every giggle, every dress, every whispered nickname was rebellion disguised as decadence. But rebellion has a cost. When the revolution finally came, the same people who once shouted her name in applause now shouted it in rage. Her every jewel was auctioned, her every rumour revived. She faced her trial with the same calm detachment that once infuriated the crowds. To the end, she refused to break character. Marie Antoinette didn't die because she was vulgar. She died because her existence reminded France of what it wanted to destroy, the theatre of monarchy itself. She wasn't the cause of the storm, just the lightning rod. And yet, her downfall didn't end the lineage of scandalous queens. If Marie's crime was indulgence, the next queen's sin was youth, because Catherine Howard was proof that even in Tudor England, a woman's charm could become a death sentence faster than a man's betrayal ever could. 4. Catherine Howard. If Anne Boleyn's downfall was a political tragedy dressed in pearls, Catherine Howard's was more like a cautionary tale whispered behind fans at court, too young, too lively, and far too naive to survive the Tudor meat grinder. She entered history like a spark in a dry room, illuminating everything for a moment, before vanishing in smoke. By the time she was queen, the fire was already burning. Catherine Howard was just a teenager when she caught the attention of Henry VIII. The king, now well past his prime and rotting under the weight of his own ambition, saw in her a kind of youthful mirage: innocence, beauty, obedience. She was not particularly educated, not politically savvy, not prepared for the machinery of monarchy, but she was young. And in a court suffocating under protocol and paranoia, youth felt like rebellion. But Catherine hadn't lived a sheltered life. Raised in the chaotic household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine's adolescence was more permissive than proper. She shared dormitories with other young women and was surrounded by male admirers, tutors, and opportunists. This wasn't unusual, but what made it fatal was that she didn't seem to understand that court life had its own rules, and that the walls could talk. By the time she married Henry in 1540, she was thrust into a gilded cage of impossible expectations. She was to be the pure, devoted balm to soothe the king's ego after his humiliating marriage to Anne of Cleves. She was expected to smile, flatter, and above all else, forget the life she had before the crown. But the past does not stay buried, not in Tudor England. Catherine's enemies wasted no time digging. Rumours circulated of her former relationships, her time in the Duchess's household, her flirtations, and eventually her past caught up with her in the form of a letter, one that allegedly revealed intimate details of her previous attachments. Suddenly, the king's angel became a liability. The court, once charmed by her lightness, turned icy with fear. Accusations flew, investigations launched, rooms were searched, testimonies gathered. Her private world was dragged into the public record, dissected like a political autopsy. To Catherine's credit, she held herself with more grace than her reputation suggests, but grace, like innocence, was not enough. She was never tried in court. Henry couldn't risk a scandal on paper, but she was declared guilty in spirit, and that was all that mattered. She had failed, in the king's eyes, to embody the one virtue Tudor queens could not live without: perfect obedience. Her downfall was swift and theatrical. Her crest was torn down, her ladies dismissed, her belongings inventoried. She became a ghost in the palace before she was even gone. The court moved on, as courts do, clinging to decorum while quietly adjusting to the absence of her laughter in the halls. Catherine Howard didn't die because she was vulgar. She died because the crown demanded a performance she couldn't sustain, a role she never auditioned for, written by men who would never be punished for their own indiscretions. In the end, it was her joy that betrayed her, not her deeds, but her audacity to be young and unafraid in a world that measured women by silence. And if Catherine's tale was one of tragic naivety, the queen who followed in our story wielded her scandal like a sword, because next comes a royal wife who decided she wasn't content to simply endure a bad marriage. She decided to end it in fire. 5. Isabella of France. History gave her a nickname straight from a Gothic novel, the She-Wolf of France. It stuck, partly because it sounded deliciously wicked, and partly because no one really knew how else to categorize Isabella of France. She wasn't passive, she wasn't pious, and she absolutely wasn't the sort of queen who waited quietly while her husband lost control of a kingdom. She had sharp claws, a colder smile, and the kind of political timing that makes or breaks entire dynasties. Born in 1295 to the French king Philip IV, who was by no means a model of mercy, Isabella was married off to Edward II of England at just 12 years old. The match was political, meant to secure peace between two restless powers. Instead, it introduced England to a new kind of scandal, one that simmered quietly at first, then boiled over in a spectacular blaze of betrayal, ambition, and whispered revenge. From the start, Isabella's marriage was less romantic union and more slow-moving disaster. Edward II was famously disinterested in his bride. Contemporary accounts suggest he lavished his affection and attention on a man named Piers Gaveston, his childhood companion and close advisor. Too close, many said. Whether the relationship was romantic, political, or just deeply codependent, it sent waves of gossip through the English court. Isabella, already a foreign princess trying to establish herself, found her position humiliating. Worse, she found herself sidelined in her own marriage, and she remembered. After Gaveston's execution by English barons, an act that Isabella likely didn't orchestrate, but certainly didn't mourn, there was a brief period of calm, but it didn't last. Edward found a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had been a scandal, Despenser was an all-out threat. He manipulated land rights, punished nobles, and alienated nearly everyone at court, all while growing more influential in the king's inner circle. Isabella watched and waited. She played the dutiful queen when it suited her. She bore Edward 4 children, including the future Edward III, but by the late 1320s, her patience ran out. While on a diplomatic mission to France, she refused to return to England. She began forming alliances, gathering support from discontented nobles, and in a move that caused chroniclers to reach for their smelling salts, she took a lover, Roger Mortimer, a powerful English exile. Together, Isabella and Mortimer launched a coup in 1326. Not a whispered conspiracy, not a soft dethroning, but a full-blown invasion. They landed with troops, gained support, and marched on the king. Edward fled, but his power crumbled behind him. Within months, he was imprisoned. Soon after, he was no longer king. Now here's where the myth deepens. Edward II's death, mysterious, unsettling, and forever unclear, was immediately pinned on Isabella and Mortimer. Chroniclers with a taste for drama described it in grim, vivid detail, though modern historians remain skeptical. The facts are scarce, and the truth lies somewhere between political convenience and poetic license. Regardless, Isabella had done the unthinkable, dethroned her husband, ruled as regent for her son, and effectively governed England alongside her lover. For 4 years they held power, and for 4 years they lived under a crown of rumours and growing resentment. Eventually, Edward III overthrew Mortimer and placed his mother under a sort of gilded house arrest. She lived out her days comfortably in a castle with servants, tapestries, and the occasional diplomatic visit. She was never tried, never condemned, because you don't put a she-wolf in chains. You just keep her somewhere quiet and hope she doesn't bite again. Isabella's scandal wasn't just her betrayal. It was that she did it so well, with elegance, with timing, with the cold efficiency of someone who understood the chessboard better than any of the men who played against her. But if Isabella plotted in castles and moved pieces on a board, the next queen didn't need strategy. She used something older than politics: brutality. She was the kind of woman who skipped the intrigue and went straight for the kill. 6. Queen Fredegund. If you could distill chaos into human form and then hand it a crown, you'd get Queen Fredegund of Neustria, one of the bloodiest and most enigmatic figures of the early medieval period. She ruled not by divine right or noble lineage, but by force of will, whispered orders, and an unapologetic flair for eliminating her problems. In a world where queens were expected to bear children and keep silent, Fredegund did one, and had very loud opinions about the other. Born around the 540s into an obscure background, likely a servant in the royal household, Fredegund climbed the ranks of Frankish society with calculated charm and surgical ambition. She first caught the eye of King Chilperic while he was still married to his first wife, Audovera. Not for long, though. Audovera was sent packing, and Fredegund filled the vacancy as queen consort, temporarily. Then came Galswintha. Chilperic, in a political alliance, married the Visigothic princess Galswintha, who brought with her not just a noble pedigree, but a sizable dowry and the kind of piety that made Fredegund look downright pagan by comparison. Galswintha didn't last long. Days after expressing her unhappiness in court, she was found dead in bed. Officially, an unfortunate turn of events. Unofficially, everyone pointed fingers at Fredegund, who, with suspiciously impeccable timing, married Chilperic shortly after. That's where the scandal begins, but it doesn't stop. Fredegund didn't just navigate royal life, she weaponized it. She wasn't a passive wife or a grieving widow, she was a power broker with a ledger of enemies, and one by one she checked off names. Chroniclers claim she orchestrated assassinations like they were dinner plans. Rival courtiers, political threats, bishops, and even family members fell under her shadow. Sometimes they vanished, sometimes they were found in regrettable conditions. Always the palace walls stayed silent. Even in a century soaked with political bloodletting, Fredegund stood out. Her favorite tool wasn't an army, it was subterfuge. She allegedly sent poisoned daggers, bribed assassins, and arranged betrayals that played out like grim theatre. One famous tale tells of her attempt to kill Brunhilde, her greatest rival and the wife of her late husband's brother. The two queens were caught in a decades-long Cold War that warmed up only when bodies started piling up. And yet, despite it all, Fredegund kept rising. After Chilperic's sudden and suspicious death in 584, yes, she was also suspected in that one, she ruled as regent for her young son, Joanna the Second. Imagine it, a former servant, now the de facto ruler of a kingdom, outmaneuvering generals and nobles, holding her ground with a combination of courtly charm and ice-veined ruthlessness. Her son would go on to become one of the most powerful Merovingian kings. He had his mother to thank for that, though he probably never said it out loud. To the church, Fredegund was a problem. To the court, she was a danger. But to history, she's a contradiction. A woman who lived at the centre of scandal but left behind almost no direct writings. We know her only through the letters of her enemies, which makes her more ghost than queen. An apparition who haunts the records, forever suspected but never tried. And if her enemies ever thought death would silence her, they miscalculated. Because Fredegund's son ruled with the same force she did. Her legacy was not one of shame, but survival. But what happens when a queen chooses scandal not for power, but for principle? The next royal in our story abandoned her crown for philosophy, wore men's clothes, and turned court protocol into a personal game of theatre. A queen who didn't want the throne, just the freedom to burn it down. 7. Queen Christina of Sweden. Queen Christina of Sweden was the kind of royal anomaly that history tries to categorize and fails. Crowned as a king, yes, king at the age of 6, she grew up surrounded by advisors who expected her to become the embodiment of Swedish Protestant virtue. Instead, she became an eccentric enigma who preferred philosophy to marriage, swordplay to embroidery, and scandal to silence. Born in 1626, Christina was raised to rule. Her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, died in battle when she was still a child, and from that moment her life became a national experiment. Could a girl be moulded into a sovereign in a kingdom that had never truly had one? The answer was yes, but not without complications. From a young age, Christina defied expectations. She reportedly insisted on wearing masculine clothing, refused to brush her hair, and showed more interest in books and military tactics than in courtly manners. Foreign envoys were puzzled. Her tutors were frustrated. But Christina was delighted. She seemed to revel in her own refusal to conform. In a court obsessed with image and virtue, she made nonconformity look regal. By her 20s, Christina had transformed Sweden into an unlikely hub of intellectualism. She corresponded with philosophers across Europe, including René Descartes, whom she famously invited to Stockholm, and promptly worked to death with early morning philosophy sessions in the freezing Nordic dark. Whether it was an accident of enthusiasm or an ill-advised flex of royal power, Descartes didn't last long in her chilly salon. He died soon after. Christina, unfazed, moved on. But it wasn't just intellectual ambition that scandalized her court. It was her personal choices. She declared she would never marry, ever. Despite the pleas of her council and the necessity of an heir, she refused all suitors. Her rationale? She found marriage tedious and limiting. "I shall never be anyone's property," she reportedly said, which in 17th century Europe translated to a public relations nightmare. The rumors escalated. Whispers about her behavior, appearance, and unwomanly habits circled the court like vultures. She had close relationships with several women, most notably her lady-in-waiting, Ebba Spara, whom she referred to in letters with intense affection. Whether these were romantic, platonic, or something in between is still debated, but to her contemporaries it was enough to raise eyebrows. Then came the ultimate scandal, abdication. In 1654, Christina stunned the kingdom by announcing she was stepping down. Just like that, no war, no uprising, no exile. She handed the throne to her cousin and walked away. The official reason was her refusal to marry and produce an heir. But it went deeper. Days later, she secretly left Sweden, disguised as a man. She travelled across Europe, finally landing in Rome, where she converted to Catholicism, an act so shocking that it sent tremors through Protestant Europe. The Queen, who had once been the shining symbol of Swedish Lutheran pride, now lounged in Vatican palaces, attending operas, flirting with cardinals, and throwing elaborate soirees. Her hosts didn't know what to do with her. Neither did history. Christina never returned to Sweden. She spent her remaining years collecting art, meddling in politics, and reminding everyone that she had chosen scandal over submission. She was not a martyr, not a saint, not even a particularly good administrator, but she was impossible to forget. And while Christina made scandal look like performance art, the next queen wore madness like a crown, wandering through the ruins of her grief, mourning a dead husband and clutching at his corpse as if time could be reversed by sheer will alone. 8. Empress Theodora. Before she was Empress of the Byzantine Empire, Theodora was something far more dangerous, a woman with a memory. She remembered everything: poverty, humiliation, survival, and when she finally rose to power, she didn't rule with forgetfulness. She ruled with purpose. Theodora was born around 500 CE, likely in Constantinople, to a bear trainer who worked for the city's notoriously bawdy hippodrome. The kind of place where political opinion was shouted between races and scandal was a spectator sport. Her early life, if later sources are to be believed, was filled with hardship and performance. Some chroniclers, particularly the famously sharp-tongued Procopius, claimed she worked as an actress in her youth, and by actress they didn't mean Shakespearean drama. In Byzantine society, the term was a polite cover for women who worked in the margins, where performance and survival were often the same thing. Now, whether Theodora was truly a courtesan, a dancer, or simply the target of later slander is impossible to prove. What matters more is what she became. After abandoning her former life, she travelled through Egypt, lived among religious ascetics, and eventually returned to Constantinople with a mind sharpened by both hardship and clarity. There, she caught the eye of Justinian, the heir to the Byzantine throne. And here's where her story twists. He didn't just make her his mistress or his secret consort. He made her his wife, legally, publicly, against the full weight of Roman law and elite disapproval. To do this, he had to rewrite the rules, literally. Justinian changed the law that prohibited senators from marrying actresses, just so he could elevate Theodora to empress. The court was horrified. The Senate whispered, but Justinian didn't care, and neither did Theodora. She stepped into the palace like she'd been born there, with a spine as straight as any general's and a stare that could shatter protocol. As empress, she did something far more revolutionary than scandalize. She governed. She didn't sit quietly beside Justinian. She stood with him, advised him, and in many cases outmaneuvered his court. When riots broke out in 532, massive city-burning uprisings known as the Nika Revolts, Justinian nearly fled. It was Theodora who stopped him. "There is no worse fate," she reportedly said, "than to be an emperor who has fled." It was a single sentence, and it saved the empire. Justinian stayed. The rebellion was crushed. Theodora's legend was sealed, but she didn't stop at bravery. She championed laws that protected women, anti-trafficking measures, increased rights in divorce, protections for former courtesans. Her enemies called this self-serving. Her supporters called it justice. History, as usual, remains undecided. And yet, despite her brilliance, Theodora never outran her past. Procopius, her most venomous biographer, wrote The Secret History, a scathing work of palace gossip and character assassination. He called her vulgar, depraved, manipulative, and perhaps she was. But if so, she was also a genius of power, one who rewrote her destiny not in ink but in marble. She died in 548, likely of cancer. Her husband never remarried. Her name remained carved into the walls of Hagia Sophia, immortalized in mosaic gold, staring back at the world with quiet defiance. Theodora didn't escape scandal. She walked through it, reshaped it, and crowned herself with it. And while Theodora rose from the margins to rule an empire, our next queen was born in a palace and spent her life unravelling within it, haunted not by politics, but by the echo of a single consuming love. 9. Queen Juana la Loca, Joanna the Second of Castile. Juana of Castile, known to history by the nickname La Loca, the Mad, has been remembered less for the crown she inherited, and more for the ghost she refused to let go. In a court world obsessed with image and reason, she became the symbol of a queen who lost both. But what history calls madness, others have seen as something far more human: obsession, grief, and the slow unravelling of a woman abandoned by everyone but her own memory. Born in 1479 to the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, Juana was never expected to rule. She was third in line, a spare daughter in a family of heirs. Her destiny was diplomatic. She was to be married off to secure alliances, not sit on thrones. And so, at 16, she was sent to the Netherlands to marry Philip the Handsome, the Habsburg Archduke, who would become the centre of her world, and many believe the source of her undoing. At first, the match seemed like something out of legend. Juana was said to be deeply in love, dangerously so. She reportedly adored Philip with a passion that made the Habsburg court uncomfortable. This was no ordinary royal marriage built on treaties and tolerable affection. This was emotional fire in a palace of ice. And when Philip inevitably grew cold and distant, focusing on politics, mistresses, and his own ambitions, Juana didn't retreat politely into silence. She burned. There are stories, half-truths, rumours, embellishments, of Juana flying into jealous rages, of her attacking the women she suspected of seducing her husband, of wandering the corridors at night in fits of weeping and fury. The court called it madness. Chroniclers whispered that her love had curdled into instability. But love was not the only force pulling her apart. Within a few years, everything around her collapsed. Her elder brother died. Her sister died, her young nephew died, her mother, Queen Isabella, passed away. And suddenly, Juana, previously the irrelevant daughter, was Queen of Castile, heir to a fractured empire, and the centerpiece of a game she didn't want to play. Philip, sensing opportunity, raced to claim power as her consort. He pushed her aside in matters of state and positioned her as unfit to rule. Then, in a twist that stunned Europe, he died suddenly at 28. Poison, illness, divine retribution, the cause remains uncertain. What is certain is what happened next. Juana broke, not publicly, not with declarations, but with a long, slow descent into the private rituals of mourning. She refused to bury Philip. She ordered his coffin transported across the countryside, following it from town to town, sometimes opening it, speaking to him, refusing to part from his side. Her court, already uneasy, declared her lost to madness. Her father, Ferdinand, returned and had her confined. Her son, Charles V, would later keep her imprisoned for decades. She remained queen in name only, locked in rooms shadowed by guards, visited only when politically necessary. They called her mad because she would not stop grieving. They called her mad because she refused to let go. They called her mad because it was easier than admitting they had stolen her crown. Juana's story became legend. The queen who slept beside a coffin, the widow who refused to move on, the royal woman whose love was too loud for politics and too inconvenient for history. And if Juana mourned in madness, our next queen was scandalized by intimacy not lost, but perhaps too well kept. Her friendship with a servant ignited rumors that rocked the British throne and left Victorian morals fumbling for explanation. 10. Queen Victoria in the Mrs. Brown scandal. Queen Victoria was supposed to be the symbol of moral purity, the Iron Widow, the emblem of restraint, the eternal mother of the empire. She wore black for 40 years after Prince Albert's death, commanding respect not just through power, but through the sheer gravity of her grief. In an age where even table legs were covered for modesty, Victoria was the gold standard of decorum. or so the Victorians liked to believe. Then came John Brown, a Scottish servant, a commoner, a man of little refinement and even less patience for protocol, and for over 2 decades the closest companion to the most powerful woman on earth. Their relationship ignited one of the most persistent and unsettling scandals of the 19th century, not because of what was proven, but because of what could never be. John Brown entered Victoria's life as a personal attendant, originally hired to help with her pony during trips to Balmoral Castle in Scotland. After Albert's death, Victoria retreated from the world. Her mourning was so intense that it became a political crisis. Parliament begged her to resume public duties. Newspapers accused her of abandoning her people. Her popularity sank. The monarchy itself wobbled under the weight of her sorrow. Enter Brown, loud, blunt, and entirely unimpressed by royal formality. He didn't bow, he didn't flatter, he called her woman when he thought she was being unreasonable, and once allegedly refused to obey a command because he found it daft. He treated her like a person, not a symbol, and Victoria, worn down by courtly suffocation, responded not with outrage, but gratitude. Soon he wasn't just a servant. He was her confidant, her gatekeeper, her protector. She signed letters from your devoted friend Victoria R.I. and even had medals struck in his honour. He was given unprecedented access to the Queen's private apartments. Servants complained, ministers bristled, her own children referred to him bitterly as Mamma's lover, though never in public, and always with a murmur. There's no concrete evidence of a romantic or physical relationship between Victoria and John Brown. But in Victorian England, perception mattered more than proof. The very idea that a queen, especially this queen, might be emotionally dependent on a rough working-class man was enough to unravel the carefully constructed myth of her moral supremacy. Cartoons mocked him. Pamphlets suggested secret marriage. Satirists dubbed her Mrs. Brown. It was a scandal of insinuation, the kind of social unease that can't be put on trial but lingers in every drawing-room whisper. What truly scandalized society wasn't impropriety, it was affection. Unfiltered, unapproved, and unclassed. In an empire obsessed with order, Victoria's friendship with John Brown looked dangerously human. She never explained herself, she never apologized, and when Brown died in 1883, Victoria grieved him with the same sincerity she had shown for Albert. She even commissioned a statue in his honor, one that later monarchs quietly removed and stored away in the shadows of Windsor. But history remembers, it always does. And if Victoria's scandal was whispered behind lace curtains, our next queen made no effort to conceal her appetites. She wrote poems, kissed power, and danced through a court already set on fire because Queen Margot never cared for discretion when drama suited her better. 11. Margaret of Valois, Queen Margot. In the blood-drenched theatre of 16th century France, Margaret of Valois, better known to history and scandal by her stage name, Queen Margot, was a royal anomaly, too clever to be silent, too passionate to be ignored, and far too unmanageable for the tightly corseted expectations of her birthright. She was a Valois princess by blood, a queen of Navarre by marriage, and a legend by choice. Where other queens tiptoed around decorum, Margot twirled past it in a cloud of perfume and Latin quotations. Born in 1553 to King Henry II of France and the infamous Catherine de Medici, yes, that Catherine, Margot came into the world as both ornament and chess piece. She was educated in multiple languages, surrounded by poets, and taught to wield beauty as both mask and weapon. From the beginning, she was designed for diplomacy, but she was never interested in playing anyone's game but her own. At the center of her scandal was a marriage so fraught it bordered on civil war, because, well, it was civil war. In 1572, Margot was married off to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, as part of a political strategy to bridge the chasm between Catholics and Huguenots. The ceremony held in Paris was meant to be symbolic. Instead, it became infamous. 6 days after the wedding, the city erupted in what would become known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Thousands of Protestants were slaughtered in the streets, allegedly with her mother's approval, possibly with the crown's silence. Margot's role in the violence remains unclear, but she saved lives that night, reportedly hiding Huguenots in her chambers and protecting her new husband from a quick and very public execution. She had barely said "I do" before she was swimming in blood and betrayal. Her marriage with Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV of France, quickly devolved into something more theatrical than romantic. They lived largely apart, pursued separate affairs, and communicated through politics more than pillow talk. Margot became known for her intellect, her independence, and her increasingly public relationships. In a time when royal women were expected to be either invisible or tragically obedient, she was neither. She hosted literary salons, wrote candid memoirs, and wore her wit as fashion. Her enemies accused her of promiscuity. Her defenders praised her for honesty. Either way, the label stuck. Queen Margot became shorthand for scandal, real, imagined, and exaggerated. She was lampooned in satirical pamphlets, gossiped about in court, and painted by history as a woman who lived far too fully for her station. Eventually, even her own family had enough. Margot was imprisoned by her brother, King Henry III, and exiled for years. She wandered through southern France with a small retinue, writing letters, charming local leaders, and continuing to defy every expectation placed on her. When she finally returned to Paris in her later years, it was on her own terms, no longer queen in title, but unmistakably regal in presence. Margot never apologized for who she was. She didn't deny her lovers, her politics, or her poetry. She didn't seek sainthood. She sought freedom. And for a queen born into a cage of dynastic duty, that alone was revolutionary. But while Margot played with the fires of desire and politics, our next queen was consumed by both. Crowned by ambition, cursed by gossip, and immortalized in a tragedy that would echo through England's bloody throne room, Anne Boleyn was not born to scandal. She created it. 12. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn never stood a chance of fading quietly into history. From the moment she arrived at the English court in the early 1520s, with French fashion on her sleeves and fire in her eyes, she made it abundantly clear that she was not going to play the supporting role in anyone else's story. And when the King of England turned his kingdom upside down just to marry her, she didn't become his prize. She became his mirror, his match, and ultimately his undoing. To say Anne was controversial is to undersell it. She was a courtier's daughter, educated abroad, fluent in French, sharp with a lute, and sharper still with her words. Her charm wasn't passive, it was deliberate. Unlike the other ladies in waiting who orbited King Henry VIII, Anne did not give in, flirt for sport, or let herself be consumed by royal attention. She withheld, she challenged, she said no, and that's what made her irresistible. Henry, then married to Catherine of Aragon, was used to getting what he wanted, but Anne didn't want to be another royal mistress. She wanted more, and the more Henry offered, the more complicated things became. What followed was a nearly 7-year campaign to annul his marriage, defy the Pope, and break from the Roman Catholic Church entirely. In 1533, Henry married Anne, and shortly after, she was crowned Queen of England. But Anne didn't simply wear the crown, she recalibrated the monarchy around her own image. She embraced the role of Protestant queen, pushed reformist thinkers, and wielded political influence in ways that unsettled the old guard. She was opinionated, unapologetically intelligent, and quick to make enemies. She didn't soften herself to make others comfortable. That, perhaps more than anything, made her dangerous. The court turned on her slowly, then all at once. Her failure to produce a male heir made her vulnerable, though she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, who would one day become England's greatest monarch. Still, in a world where a queen's value was measured in sons, Anne's crown grew heavier by the day. And while Henry's affection had once seemed boundless, it curdled quickly into impatience. then suspicion, then a kind of theatrical cruelty. The charges against her were dramatic: adultery, incest, treason. 5 men were named, including her own brother. The evidence was flimsy, the confessions likely coerced, but the verdict was inevitable. Anne's real crime had nothing to do with the allegations and everything to do with power. She had seized it too boldly, worn it too visibly, and rattled too many cages along the way. Even in her final days, Anne maintained a strange sort of composure. She joked about her little neck, as if mocking the very spectacle of her execution. She didn't beg, she didn't confess. She exited as she had entered, defiant, composed, and impossible to ignore. Anne Boleyn wasn't destroyed by scandal. She was built from it. She took the role of queen and rewrote it, not as a passive consort, but as a political player, a cultural force, and a woman whose ambition was larger than her husband's patience. But where Anne Boleyn's downfall was wrapped in rumours of lust and betrayal, our next queen bathed her reign in something far less seductive: fire, fear, and the unrelenting certainty of holy vengeance. Because when Mary I took the throne, she didn't just want to rule, she wanted to purify. 13. Mary I of England, Bloody Mary. Mary Tudor never asked to be feared, but history gave her no choice. Born in 1516, Mary was the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Her early childhood was one of royal promise. She was educated, doted on, and treated as the rightful heir to the English throne. But when Henry's obsession with a male successor spiraled into divorce, schism, and Anne Boleyn, Mary became a living reminder of everything he wanted to forget. She was declared illegitimate, separated from her mother, stripped of her status, and forced to recognize the woman she viewed as a usurper. That kind of betrayal doesn't go away, it hardens. When Mary finally took the throne in 1553, after the death of her half-brother Edward VI and a brief attempted coup by Lady Jane Grey, she was 37 years old and deeply, bitterly aware of how unstable crowns could be. Her ascent wasn't smooth, and neither was her reign, but she arrived with one goal: to restore Catholicism to a kingdom that had, in her view, lost its soul. What followed would earn her a reputation blackened by centuries of Protestant propaganda, and a nickname, Bloody Mary, that turned a woman into a cautionary ghost story. Between 1555 and 1558, Mary's government sanctioned the execution of nearly 300 Protestants, many by public burning. These were not battlefield deaths or whispered assassinations. They were highly visible, brutally symbolic acts meant to terrify and to purify. Bishops, preachers, and everyday believers alike were accused of heresy and given a choice: recant or burn. Most chose the fire, but Mary's motivations were not as simple as cruelty. To her, England's salvation depended on unity through faith. She saw Protestantism not just as a theological shift, but as a betrayal of her mother, her heritage, and her God. Her persecution wasn't born of sadism, it was born of conviction, and that's what made it all the more chilling. Still, Mary was not without moments of vulnerability, and it's there that her humanity cuts through the myth. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, meant to cement a Catholic alliance, was widely unpopular in England. He was foreign, cold, and largely absent. Mary, by contrast, was desperate for love, for legitimacy, for a child to secure her legacy. She suffered at least 2 false pregnancies, each one unraveling her politically and emotionally. Her body betrayed her. Her court whispered. Her people grew restless. As her reign faltered, so did her health. She died in 1558, sick, childless, and with her half-sister Elizabeth waiting quietly in the wings. Mary's legacy was immediately recast by the Protestant regimes that followed. The martyrdom of her victims became propaganda. Her Catholic policies were vilified. Her very name became shorthand for religious fanaticism. But beneath the bonfires and the black robes was a woman who had lived her whole life in the shadow of rejection, first by her father, then by history itself. She wasn't vulgar in the way tabloids like to imagine. She was something arguably more dangerous, devout, determined, and unwilling to bend. And while Mary ruled with fire, our next queen burned with rumour. Her reputation was stained not by violence, but by whispers, accusations of hidden lovers, poetic scandal, and a quiet rebellion dressed in velvet. Because not all scandal shouts. Sometimes it sighs, just loudly enough to be heard by history. 14. Philippa of Hainault. Queen Philippa of Hainault may not be the first name that comes to mind when one thinks of scandal. Compared to her Tudor or Bourbon successors, she lived a relatively tranquil royal life, or at least that's what the official story insists. But beneath the polished accounts of loyalty, bravery, and queenly virtue, there lingers an older, less flattering echo. A murmur from medieval chroniclers who, despite their polite wording, occasionally dropped hints that Philippa's behaviour wasn't always what one might call queenly. Born in 1314 in what is now Belgium, Philippa was a noblewoman of practical charm and political importance. She was betrothed to Edward III of England while still a child, a pawn in a chessboard of continental alliances. When she finally arrived in England, she brought with her a reputation for beauty, piety, and solid dynastic credentials. She was crowned queen in 1330 at the age of 16, and in time she would become one of the most respected queens in medieval English history. But respected is not the same as uncontroversial. Contemporary chroniclers like Jean Froissart, who knew Philippa personally, painted her in a largely flattering light. She was compassionate, wise, and loyal. Her famous intervention in 1347 to save the lives of the burghers of Calais, prisoners marked for execution by Edward, earned her a permanent spot in England's sentimental memory. And she did what most queens were expected to do. She bore children. 14 of them, in fact. And yet, even with the narrative of domestic virtue firmly in place, the record trembles at the edges. Several medieval writers, many writing decades later, made curious remarks about the Queen's court. Rumours of flirtation, whispers of over-familiarity, suggestions that Philippa may have indulged in unseemly liberties. Was this misogynistic embroidery? Almost certainly, but it was embroidery specific to her. No such stories circulate about her contemporaries without cause or purpose. That doesn't make them true. It makes them useful. One accusation, subtle and often skipped over, came from later critics who suggested that Philippa's influence over Edward III was too soft, too accommodating. While not framed as scandal in the modern sense, it played into a familiar medieval trope. The Queen as the overly permissive wife, too affectionate, too enabling. Her tolerance of Edward's increasingly lavish court, filled with tournaments, feasts, and noble favourites, was blamed for the crown's spiralling expenses. She was, they said, indulgent, too generous, too fond of entertainment. There were also vague implications that she was perhaps not always as modest as her official portrait suggested. Her taste in fashion was reportedly lavish, her presence at court lively and animated. In a medieval England still torn between austerity and display, a queen who smiled too much, dressed too richly, or enjoyed herself too openly could quickly become suspect. What makes Philippa's alleged vulgarity so fascinating is precisely how quietly it's been filed away. No execution, no exile, no revolution. Just a woman who smiled too brightly, laughed too freely, and perhaps let the court get a bit too comfortable with her. That, in the stiff upper lip world of medieval monarchy, was enough. But while Philippa's legend remains cloaked in ambiguity, the next queen in our procession carried no such subtlety. Her scandal was worn on her sleeve and across the pages of international espionage, betrayal, and 3 doomed marriages. Because Mary, Queen of Scots, didn't just attract controversy, she married it. 15. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart's life reads less like a royal biography and more like a centuries-long argument disguised as a soap opera. Catholic or Protestant, murderess or martyr, queen or pawn. She was crowned as an infant, raised in a foreign court, and pursued by scandal as persistently as she pursued stability. Spoiler, neither caught the other. Born in 1542, Mary became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old, an infant monarch whose inheritance was a political powder keg wrapped in velvet. Her mother, a French noblewoman, arranged for Mary to be sent to France at age 5, where she was raised not as a humble northern princess, but as a future queen of Europe. And for a while, that prophecy seemed likely. She married the Dauphin, became Queen of France, and stood poised to rule 2 kingdoms. But then her husband died, and the fairy tale fell apart. At 18, Mary returned to Scotland, a widow and a queen in her own right. But home, as it turned out, was not where the heart was. It was where the religious wars, suspicious nobles, and old grudges lived. Protestant reformers viewed her Catholicism with alarm. Her French education didn't help, and while Mary was intelligent, charming, and politically savvy, her personal choices quickly stirred a storm she could never fully escape. The first real scandal came with her second marriage to her cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Handsome, arrogant, and politically inconvenient, Darnley turned from royal spouse to royal embarrassment in record time. Their marriage soured almost instantly, plagued by jealousy, public arguments, and Darnley's ambition to claim the crown matrimonial, equal power with Mary. She refused. He sulked, and then it got worse. In 1566, Darnley and a group of nobles stormed into Mary's private chambers and murdered her secretary, David Rizzio, in front of her while she was pregnant. It was a grotesque spectacle of violence and betrayal, and it shocked all of Europe. Mary managed to keep her composure, gave birth to her son James, the future James VI of Scotland and I of England, and tried to hold the centre of her world together. She failed. Less than a year later, Darnley was dead, blown up in an explosion outside Edinburgh, or more precisely strangled and then blown up to hide the evidence. Suspicion fell on James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a bold and controversial figure already circling Mary's court. Weeks after Darnley's death, Mary married Bothwell. Voluntarily or not, no one can say with certainty. But to her enemies, it didn't matter. The Protestant nobility revolted. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, and eventually fled to England, seeking protection from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, a miscalculation, to say the least. Elizabeth saw Mary not as family, but as a threat, a Catholic with a claim to her throne and a reputation already wrapped in intrigue. Mary would spend the next 19 years in various English castles, the Queen without a kingdom, under a velvet form of house arrest. She wrote letters, plotted escape, trusted too easily, and became the focal point of conspiracies both real and invented. When a Catholic plot to assassinate Elizabeth was uncovered, one that Mary may or may not have known about, it was enough. In 1587, she was executed. At 44, she died with dignity, dressed in red, the colour of martyrdom. Mary's life was not simply scandalous, it was scandal as legacy. Every decision she made, every man she loved, every alliance she misjudged was recorded, analysed, weaponised. She became the cautionary tale queens whispered about. But where Mary's scandals revolved around desire and downfall, the next queen earned her place in history by challenging an empire, defying Rome, and ruling a desert court with a gaze sharp enough to make emperors hesitate. Zenobia didn't fall into scandal, she marched into it. 16. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. Zenobia of Palmyra was the kind of queen that Roman emperors feared in public and obsessed over in private. She wasn't just bold, she was blasphemously audacious, the kind of woman who looked at the Roman Empire, not with reverence, but with conquest in mind. And while many queens throughout history have caused scandal by breaking rules, Zenobia simply rewrote them as she went. She ruled in the 3rd century CE, a time when the Roman Empire was fraying at the edges, plagued by internal instability, succession crises, and external threats that refused to stay politely outside the borders. Palmyra, a wealthy oasis city in modern-day Syria, had long existed as a client state, a jewel in Rome's dusty eastern crown. But after the suspicious death of her husband, Odenathus, who had ruled Palmyra with Roman approval, Zenobia stepped into power as regent for her young son. And from the moment she assumed the reins, she made it clear she wasn't interested in being a placeholder. She was, by all accounts, a striking figure, literate, multilingual, and thoroughly aware of her image. She claimed descent from Cleopatra, styled herself as the new Eastern Empress, and surrounded herself with philosophers and scholars. She issued coins with her own face. And she didn't just preserve Palmyra's autonomy, she expanded it, marching her armies across Egypt, Anatolia, and parts of the Levant. This was more than a local uprising. It was imperial theatre. Zenobia wasn't simply rebelling, she was crafting a narrative, one in which she, a woman in a patriarchal empire, was not only capable of leading, but destined to rule. The Romans called it treason. Zenobia called it ambition. Naturally, her rise sent Rome into a quiet panic. Emperor Aurelian, who had just finished putting out fires in the western provinces, turned his attention east. What followed was one of the most daring military campaigns of the century. Zenobia's forces held strong until they didn't. She was eventually captured, either fleeing to Persia or waiting at the gates of her capital, depending on which chronicler you believe. But even in defeat, she refused to give the performance of shame that Roman victors expected. Aurelian, impressed by her composure and intelligence, reportedly spared her life. She was paraded through the streets of Rome in golden chains during his triumph, but even this humiliation was twisted into a kind of mythic flourish. Instead of shrinking, Zenobia stood tall, a queen reduced in title but not in legend. What makes Zenobia's scandal so enduring isn't licentiousness, betrayal, or decadence, it's defiance. She defied Rome, she defied gender, she defied geography. A woman from the desert who dared to call herself Augusta, dared to mint coins in her own name, dared to say, "I belong on the map," and meant it. And though her reign was short, her myth was not. Later writers couldn't decide whether to vilify her or canonize her. Some called her a rebel, others a philosopher queen. All agreed she was dangerous. But while Zenobia's scandal was carved on coins and marched in sandals, the queen who follows left her legacy in something far colder, a reign remembered not for speeches or soldiers, but for silence, suspicion, and fear. Because Queen Ranavalona didn't court scandal, she was the scandal. 17. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar. In the long ledger of royal scandal, Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar occupies a category all her own, not because of flirtations or indiscretions, but because her rule was so extreme, so mercilessly unconventional, that even European colonizers, no strangers to cruelty themselves, shuddered at the mention of her name. She didn't scandalize the court with gossip, she scandalized the concept of monarchy itself, by flipping it inside out and lighting it on fire. Ranavalona came to power in 1828 under strange and slippery circumstances. She wasn't a direct heir to the throne of the Marina Kingdom, but she was politically positioned, married to a prince, connected to power, and ambitious enough to see opportunity in death. When King Radama I died without a legitimate son, Ranavalona moved fast. With help from loyalist factions, she outmaneuvered rivals and claimed the throne for herself. And from that moment on, Madagascar ceased to be a polite ally of European influence and became a kingdom of isolation, suspicion, and brutal internal control. The scandal, however, wasn't in her rise. It was in her reign. Ranavalona expelled Christian missionaries, banned the teaching of foreign religions, and declared Madagascar would follow its own path, free from the encroachment of colonial minds and foreign gods. In theory, this was anti-imperial resistance. In practice, it quickly turned into a reign of terror. Converts were persecuted, priests were executed, trials by ordeal, most notoriously the Tangina poison test, were reinstated, leading to thousands of deaths based not on evidence but on ritual superstition. The Queen ruled with what some called divine authority and others described as iron paranoia. She suspected plots everywhere, and sometimes there were, but just as often her purges were preemptive, sweeping away dissent before it could breathe. Noble families were cut down, officials vanished, loyalty was rewarded, hesitation was fatal, and yet, despite all this, Ranavalona maintained her grip on power for over 30 years. She didn't merely survive, she thrived, at least by the metrics of a monarch who measured stability in fear. Foreign powers, particularly France and Britain, tried to interfere. They sent diplomats, missionaries, even military expeditions. Most failed. She outlasted them all. To her supporters, she was a nationalist, preserving Malagasy identity against colonial aggression. To her enemies, she was a tyrant in a palace, speaking to ancestors and sentencing her own people to death by ritual. The truth, as always, lies tangled between the two. Ranavalona died in 1861, having resisted foreign rule more effectively than most of her contemporaries. But her methods left a scar on history, one still debated today. Was she a defender of independence or a destroyer of her people? A revolutionary or a despot? The scandal isn't just what she did, it's that no one agrees on why. And, while Ranavalona's name evokes dread, the next Queen's scandal was something far more elusive, a soft rebellion cloaked in poetry, painted in the colours of the Spanish court, where queens whispered verses and lovers waited behind curtains. Sometimes scandal doesn't storm the palace. Sometimes it sings inside it. 18. Christina of Spain and other scandal queens of the Spanish court. In the echoing halls of Spain's royal palaces, where etiquette was stiff as brocade and appearances mattered more than reality, Queen Christina of Spain, and a constellation of other scandal-marked queens, danced quietly between the lines of duty and defiance. Their scandals weren't the loud, sword-drawn kind. They were subtler, drenched in perfume, sung in poetry, and passed through folded letters. And yet, for all their softness, they hit the rigid Spanish court like thunder. Let's begin with Queen Christina of Bourbon II Sicilies, consort of Ferdinand VII of Spain. At first glance, Christina didn't look like trouble. She married the king in 1829, bore him 2 daughters, and was expected to play the usual role of dynastic mother and silent shadow. But silence never suited Christina. After Ferdinand's death in 1833, she was declared regent for her daughter, the future Isabella II. This might have been a time for mourning and measured governance. Instead, Christina became one of the most controversial women in Spanish royal history. Scandal came swiftly. Shortly after becoming regent, Christina secretly married a former guardsman, Agustin Fernando Muñoz, a man well below her station and considered utterly unsuitable by the high society elites. It wasn't just that she married beneath her, it was that she did it in secret, then pretended it hadn't happened while continuing to wield power. Whispers filled the court of children born quietly, of favours granted too freely, of a queen behaving far too much like a woman. When the secret finally broke into the open, the nobility gasped. The regent of Spain, widow of the king, was living in what many called moral disorder. She was labelled corrupt, greedy, manipulative. Political enemies claimed she sold favours for personal gain, and her influence over young Isabella, Spain's first ruling queen in centuries, was seen as poisonous. But Christina wasn't alone in scandal. The Spanish court had long been fertile ground for queens with a flair for disruption. Earlier queens like Maria Louisa of Parma, consort of Charles IV, had been accused of inappropriate liaisons and political meddling. Later, Isabella II herself would be smeared with accusations of infidelity and favoritism, her court swirling with gossip about secret lovers and palace intrigues. Then there was poetry, the dangerous kind. Some Spanish queens were known for their patronage of sensual literature, or even penning verses that hinted at desires left unspoken in public. The court, with its formal Catholic surface, tolerated very little in the way of unorthodox femininity. A queen who smiled too often at the wrong courtier or published too lyrical a stanza could find herself accused of moral laxity, a polite phrase hiding real venom. The irony, of course, was that the Spanish crown needed its queens to be more than ornamental. They were mothers of dynasties, arbiters of alliances, symbols of stability. But woe to the queen who stepped outside the frame. And yet, for all the sideways glances and scandals scribbled in margins, these queens survived. But the next empress didn't just survive scandal, she wielded it like a weapon. Her enemies called her wicked, her admirers called her a genius. And somewhere between concubine and crown, Wu Zetian changed the rules entirely. 19. Empress Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian was not supposed to rule China. She was not born into royalty, not promised a throne, and certainly not groomed to become the only woman in over 2 millennia of imperial Chinese history to declare herself emperor in her own right. Yet by the time she was finished, she had clawed her way from concubine to empress regnant through palace walls, gossip, bureaucracy, and the grinding machinery of one of the world's most rigid patriarchies. And she did it all with a gaze so steady it made ministers sweat. Born in 624 CE to a wealthy, educated family, Wu entered the imperial court at age 14 as a concubine to Emperor Taizong. She was assigned a low rank and spent years in the shadows, more footnote than figure. But she watched, she learned. And when the emperor died, she was sent, as custom demanded, to a Buddhist convent, her political value supposedly extinguished with his life. She had other plans. Instead of disappearing quietly, Wu caught the eye of Taizong's son and successor, Emperor Gaozong, who brought her back to court. Scandalous already. What followed was something even more daring. She ascended not just as his favored concubine, but eventually as his wife, replacing the existing empress, an act nearly unheard of in Tang China. Removing an empress was not a political maneuver, it was a storm, and Wu made sure it hit with precision. Her rise was accompanied by allegations so sensational they still echo centuries later, rumors that she eliminated rivals, even her own child, to solidify her claim to power. Confucian historians, furious at her defiance of gender roles, painted her as monstrous, cruel, lustful, manipulative. They accused her of using sorcery, of seducing everyone from ministers to monks, and of creating a court obsessed with spectacle and sin. But look past the slander, and something more complicated emerges. Wu was ruthless, yes, but no more so than any emperor before or after her. And unlike many of them, she governed effectively. She strengthened the civil service exam system, promoted capable administrators regardless of their birth, and emphasized merit over nobility. Under her rule, the Tang dynasty saw stability, prosperity, and territorial expansion. She took the title of emperor, not empress dowager, not regent, but Huangdi, a title previously reserved for men. It wasn't just symbolic, it was revolutionary. Her court, filled with poets and spies, was equal parts brilliance and paranoia. She used Buddhism to legitimize her rule, built temples, and commissioned works declaring her divine. Her critics called it blasphemy, her subjects called it governance. Wu died in 705, forced to abdicate but not erased. Even in death, historians struggled with her. To praise her reign was to condone her method. To condemn her method was to ignore her success, and so she remains. The scandal they couldn't kill, the empress they couldn't explain. But if Wu Zetian ruled through reform, cloaked in rumor, the next empress let the whispers run wild, crafting power through shadows and screens behind silk curtains where concubines played politics better than kings ever could. 20. Empress Dowager Cixi. Empress Dowager Cixi didn't inherit an empire, she absorbed it, gradually, quietly, with the patience of a chess master and the instincts of someone who understood exactly how far a woman could go in Qing dynasty China if she never admitted she wanted to rule. She began as a low-ranking concubine and ended as the most powerful woman in China for nearly half a century. In between, there were whispers of indulgence, manipulation, misrule, and seduction, not all of which were unearned. Cixi entered the Forbidden City at 16, chosen as one of Emperor Xianfong's many concubines, not his favorite, not his highest ranking, just another name in the registry, until she gave birth to his only son. That changed everything. When the emperor died in 1861, her son was named the heir. He was 5 years old, and suddenly Cixi was no longer a footnote. She was the mother of the emperor, and in that title a quiet revolution began. Alongside the senior Empress Dowager Qian, Cixi ruled from behind a silk screen, issuing orders in her son's name. But as her co-regent faded from court life and eventually died under ambiguous circumstances, Cixi expanded her authority. Ministers bowed to her, princes were exiled or executed, and the screen, it might as well have been a throne. Her rule was immediately controversial. She was accused of nepotism, of manipulating court factions, of interfering with reform. Foreign diplomats, uncomfortable with a woman holding such influence, depicted her as devious and vain. Chinese conservatives viewed her as a destabilizing force. And yet, she governed, surviving coups, rebellions, and court intrigue with relentless poise. The most enduring scandal, however, wasn't a single act, but her lifestyle. Tales of her lavish spending filled the memoirs of her critics. Pearl-studded gowns, elaborate banquets, ornate gardens, and a personal retreat famously rebuilt with funds allegedly intended for the Chinese Navy. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. As foreign powers chipped away at China's sovereignty, Cixi was accused of padding her silk cushions with what should have been cannonballs. She also dabbled in personal myth-making. Her portraits were carefully staged, her audience tightly controlled, her public image layered in contradiction. Part serene mother of the empire, part ruthless architect of its slow decline. But her rule wasn't simply decadence and delay. She supported some modernizing reforms, including the introduction of telegraph lines, the establishment of foreign language schools, and a cautious embrace of Western diplomacy. Her legacy is messy, half cautionary tale, half misunderstood pragmatist. Cixi died in 1908, reportedly having poisoned her own nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, just a day before. He had favored reform too quickly, too loudly. She preferred the long game. In the end, her greatest scandal wasn't that she ruled. It was that she never admitted she wanted to. And while Cixi governed behind curtains, the queen who comes next ruled with the blinds wide open, facing mobs, rumours and revolutions with a fan in one hand and a scandal in the other. Because Queen Isabella II didn't hide her chaos, she reigned in it. 21. Queen Isabella II of Spain. If Spain's 19th century were a stage play, Queen Isabella II would be the queen who forgot her lines, threw out the script, and set the curtain on fire, while insisting with a polite smile that everything was perfectly under control. Crowned as a child and dethroned in middle age, Isabella's reign was a whirlwind of palace intrigues, public outcry, and the kind of personal life that made both conservatives and liberals reach for smelling salts. She was born in 1830, the daughter of King Ferdinand VII and Maria Christina of the Two Sicilies. Her father, eager to keep his throne out of the hands of his brother, changed Spanish succession laws to allow his daughter to inherit the crown. This decision ignited the Carlist Wars, a civil conflict that would simmer for decades, with one faction supporting Isabella's right to rule and another insisting she had no business on the throne, especially not with her gender, her youth, and as it would turn out, her temperament. Isabella was crowned at the age of 3. Yes, 3. Her mother served as regent, but court politics quickly became a knife fight in a narrow hallway. By the time Isabella was a teenager, she was already the symbol of a deeply divided Spain. The church wanted her pious, liberals wanted her progressive, conservatives wanted her obedient. No one wanted her scandalous. Unfortunately for them, she didn't get the memo. At 16, Isabella was married off to her cousin, Francis of Cadiz, a union so politically motivated and personally awkward that even foreign diplomats whispered about its absurdity. Francis was seen as effeminate, uninterested, and ill-suited to rule beside her. Rumours abounded that the marriage was never consummated, that the king preferred opera costumes to royal decrees, and that Isabella found companionship elsewhere. The court was awash in allegations of her many lovers, some named, others merely speculated upon. Military officers, politicians, even clergy. No rumour was too wild, and no name too sacred. The Queen's supposed infidelities became political weapons. Opponents accused her of turning the court into a playground, of favouring lovers over ministers, and of dragging Spain into constitutional chaos by surrounding herself with sycophants. And to make matters worse, the country itself was unravelling. Multiple uprisings, constant cabinet reshuffles, economic instability, and mounting frustrations over her inability or unwillingness to restore order. In 1868, after decades of turmoil, the Spanish people had enough. A revolution, La Gloriosa, forced her to flee to France, where she lived in a kind of glamorous exile, more socialite than sovereign. In 1870, she abdicated in favour of her son, Alfonso XII, who would later become king and attempt to restore the monarchy's reputation. Even in exile, Isabella couldn't quite shake the scandal. She hosted salons in Paris, meddled in Spanish politics from afar, and lived more freely than she ever could under the weight of her crown. She died in 1904, a monarch remembered less for policies and more for personalities, her own and those of the many people said to orbit her bed, her court, and her undoing. Her reign wasn't just turbulent. It was emblematic of a monarchy at war with modernity, morality, and itself. And if Isabella's court was a theatre of scandal, the Queen who comes next lived hers as a public breakdown, with Parliament, the press, and an entire empire watching a royal marriage rot in real time. Because Queen Caroline didn't fall from grace, she was shoved, and she shoved back. 22. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. If ever there was a queen who turned royal scandal into a national sport, it was Caroline of Brunswick. She didn't merely scandalise the monarchy, she put it on trial, paraded its dirty laundry through the streets of London, and dared the British public to choose sides. And they did, loudly. Caroline arrived in England in 1795 to marry her cousin George, Prince of Wales, later George IV. The union was not a love match. It was a political arrangement stitched together by dynastic necessity and a mutual disdain that began almost immediately. George reportedly disliked her from the moment they met, famously asking for brandy after their first conversation. Caroline found him vain, drunk, and already entangled with his longtime mistress, Maria Fitzherbert. The marriage was doomed before the ink on the wedding certificate was dry. Still, they went through with it. One child, Princess Charlotte, was born the following year, and then the couple separated, more in disgust than in formality. George retreated to his lavish lifestyle. Caroline, pushed out of court life, embarked on a personal and political odyssey that would make her name infamous across Europe. Exiled from the centre of royal life, Caroline embraced her outsider status. She lived abroad for years, travelling through Europe, surrounding herself with a rather colourful cast of companions and becoming the subject of 1,000 whisper campaigns. British agents followed her from Italy to the Mediterranean, collecting stories, rumours and testimonies about her supposed behaviour. She was said to host wild parties, wear revealing clothes, and maintain an inappropriate closeness with certain members of her household staff, most notably a servant named Bartolomeo Pergami. Was any of it true? Maybe, maybe not, but truth wasn't the point. Scandal stuck because it fit. Caroline didn't behave like a queen, and in the starchy atmosphere of Georgian England, that was unforgivable. When George III died in 1820 and her estranged husband ascended the throne as George IV, Caroline returned to England to claim her title as Queen Consort. The king was furious. He tried to bar her from the coronation, strip her of her titles, and erase her from public life altogether. But Caroline, never one to retreat quietly, went to war, publicly, dramatically, and with a defiance that delighted the common people. The House of Lords was dragged into the mess. A full-blown trial, the Pains and Penalties Bill, was launched to dissolve her marriage and deny her queenship on grounds of alleged adultery. The proceedings were salacious, with tales of foreign debauchery, improper conduct, and the Queen's supposed moral ruin. But the public was not on the King's side. Caroline became a symbol of popular resistance, a flawed but relatable woman pitted against a corrupt monarchy. Crowds cheered her in the streets. Satirists skewered George. Political pamphlets portrayed her as a folk hero. In the end, the bill failed. George barred her from the coronation anyway, and just weeks later, Caroline died, aged 53, of what doctors called an intestinal illness, but what many saw as heartbreak, humiliation, and exhaustion from a battle she had fought almost entirely alone. Her legacy wasn't noble, it was messy, defiant, human. She didn't restore the monarchy's dignity, she exposed it. And the Queen who follows her did something similar. Except her scandal didn't rage in Parliament or courtrooms. It flickered quietly in drawing rooms and between the lines of old letters, where loyalty and intimacy blurred and royal friendship whispered too loudly. 23. Queen Anne of Great Britain. In the delicate theatre of British monarchy, where queens were expected to embody restraint and emotional neutrality, Queen Anne stood out, not for loud scandal or reckless behaviour, but for something far more unsettling to her contemporaries: intimacy. Her reign was painted in political conflict, religious tension, and war, but it was her personal life, quiet, emotional, and murky, that historians and gossip-mongers alike couldn't seem to leave alone. Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs, crowned in 1702 after the turbulent reigns of her predecessors. She was pious, conservative, and chronically unwell. Her health was fragile, her pregnancies numerous and tragically unsuccessful, 17 in total, with no surviving heir. She ruled during a time of immense transformation. The Act of Union in 1707 united England and Scotland into Great Britain, and the War of the Spanish Succession consumed her early reign. But despite the weight of empire on her shoulders, the court's fascination was drawn elsewhere, toward her inner circle. At the centre of that intrigue was Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, Anne's childhood friend, and, for many years, her closest confidant. Their relationship was intense, personal, and deeply interwoven with court politics. Sarah was not just a lady of the bedchamber. She was a political powerhouse, married to John Churchill, the famed general of the time. Her access to Anne gave her influence over appointments, policies, and even personal decisions. The friendship began warmly, filled with affectionate letters, pet names, and near-constant communication. Anne, isolated by her status and her failing health, leaned heavily on Sarah for both emotional support and advice. But the closeness began to unsettle observers. Letters between them were uncomfortably affectionate by 18th century standards, with Anne expressing devotion that, depending on one's reading, bordered on romantic obsession. Sarah, for her part, alternated between loving flattery and strategic manipulation. When the friendship soured, as intense friendships often do, it turned venomous. Political disagreements, jealousy, and Sarah's increasing arrogance led to a collapse that played out across the entire court. Anne replaced Sarah with Abigail Masham, another cousin of Sarah's, and a woman viewed by many as quieter, more agreeable, and far more suspicious. Whispers began again. Was Abigail Anne's new favourite? Was it merely friendship or something more? The gossip was less about evidence and more about suggestion. In an age where female rulers were already viewed as unnatural, the idea of a queen consumed by personal affections and possibly private passions was irresistible to pamphleteers and enemies alike. Anne never addressed the rumours directly. She wasn't flamboyant. She didn't parade lovers through her court. But she did nurture deeply emotional bonds with women, bonds that defied simple political alliances and blurred the lines of expected decorum. That, more than anything, made her scandalous, not because of what she did, but because of how intensely she felt and how unwilling she was to perform cold indifference for the sake of appearances. Queen Anne died in 1714, her health broken, her friendships shattered, her throne passing to a German cousin she'd never met. Her reign was foundational for modern Britain, but her legacy remains tangled in emotional complexity. And if Anne's scandals lived between the lines, the queens of the cold north took a far less subtle approach. Because in the snow-covered courts of Scandinavia, scandal wasn't whispered. It was toasted in royal halls, wagered over dice, and carried on the boots of lovers who didn't bother to sneak in through the back. 24. Christina of Denmark and other Scandinavian scandal queens. Scandinavian queens don't always make the international scandal lists, but only because their royal courts were better at burying the bodies under snowdrifts of diplomacy and Lutheran silence. Yet behind the chill of northern restraint lay women whose lives were anything but modest. Among them stands Christina of Denmark, who famously said no to a king, flirted with politics, and left behind a portrait that still smirks at history. And she was far from the only queen in the north to scandalize her era, not with carnage or conquest, but with wit, refusal, and an unflinching appetite for personal freedom. Born in 1521, Christina of Denmark was niece to Emperor Charles V and, through a dizzying web of dynastic arrangements, was married off at the age of 16 to the Duke of Milan. She became a widow just a year later. Young, politically valuable, and now back on the market, she was quickly thrown into the royal matchmaking pool. Kings, emperors, and politicians lined up for her hand, not for love, of course, but for leverage. Among the suitors was England's King Henry VIII, fresh off a series of disastrous marital experiments. Christina's reply? If I had two heads, I would gladly put one at the disposal of the King of England. It was a line so sharp it became legend. No polite rejection, no courtly ambiguity, just a clean, sarcastic refusal that sliced through the pomp like a dagger through buttered rye. But Christina's scandal wasn't simply in her quip, it was in her attitude. She defied the expectation that royal widows would remarry quickly and obediently. She navigated courts across Europe with her own political sensibilities, sometimes flirting with alliances, sometimes rebuffing them, always on her terms. She eventually remarried, this time to the Duke of Lorraine, but even then, she maintained an unusually high level of independence and was often accused of being too active in affairs of state, which in 16th century terms translated to not waiting quietly behind a tapestry. But Christina was just one among a series of Nordic noblewomen who made the crown look more like a stage than a symbol of sacred duty. Take Queen Desiree Clary of Sweden. Once engaged to Napoleon Bonaparte, she ended up Queen of Sweden and Norway. Her reign was filled with eye rolls at royal protocol, refusals to learn Swedish, and open dislike of court formalities. Then there was Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark, whose alleged affair with the royal physician Johann Struensee nearly brought down the entire monarchy. While not Scandinavian by birth, she ruled from Copenhagen, where whispers of nighttime rides and political bedding turned into very public trials. Even in Norway and Iceland, where monarchy never fully rooted itself in the same way, legendary women from sagas and aristocracy left behind reputations for strong wills, sharp tongues, and scandalous partnerships. often recast by later historians as difficult, eccentric, or the classic catch-all, unfeminine. These queens weren't vulgar in the tabloid sense. They were scandalous because they refused to perform the script written for them. They gambled, spoke out of turn, travelled freely, and chose pleasure over protocol. And yet, next comes a queen from an entirely different theatre, one whose life unspooled in the waning light of ancient Egypt, where court intrigues tangled with Roman ambition, and where scandal wasn't an accident, it was a weapon. Queen Berenice didn't just rule, she dared to love publicly, and that was enough to damn her. 25. Queen Berenice of Egypt, in the twilight of the Hellenistic world, where Rome cast its shadow over every Eastern throne, Queen Berenice of Egypt stepped into power with a crown in one hand and a ticking clock in the other. Her reign was short, scandalous, and soaked in political tension. She didn't inherit a stable court. She walked into a minefield and chose, with regal stubbornness, to dance through it. There were several queens named Berenice in ancient Egypt, but the most infamous among them was Berenice IV, the daughter of Ptolemy XII Auletes, also known as the flute player, a king whose leadership style mixed performative charm with financial recklessness. His rule relied so heavily on Roman support that when he was deposed by his own people for excessive taxation and foreign dependence, it was less of a coup and more of a collective eye-roll. In 58 BCE, Ptolemy fled Egypt, leaving his teenage daughter Berenice behind to manage the throne. And manage it she did, at first with shared power alongside a co-regent, and then, as often happens when royal siblings are involved, alone. The exact details of her early reign are murky, but what's clear is that Berenice understood the gravity of her situation. Egypt needed a ruler, and Rome was watching. But here's where the scandal began. She needed a husband, not because she wanted one, but because the optics of a young, unmarried queen ruling without male supervision were just too much for her advisors, and for the diplomatic balance of the region. Suitors were summoned, alliances proposed. None satisfied her. Then came Seleucus Kibiosactes, a Syrian prince with acceptable bloodlines but a deeply unfortunate personality. His nickname alone, Kibiosactes, meaning salted fishmonger, speaks volumes. He may have had the right pedigree, but he lacked every other quality expected of a consort. His manners offended the court. His behavior embarrassed the queen, and in a move as swift as it was ruthless, Berenice had him executed after just a few days of marriage, unceremoniously removed. No scandalous court case, just a silent exit, Roman style. Then she married again, this time to Archelaus, who claimed to be the son of Mithridates VI of Pontus, another Eastern ruler who had famously resisted Roman dominance. Whether he actually was is debatable. What matters more is that the marriage was likely politically motivated, a pairing of mutual defiance, possibly affection, and certainly a middle finger to Rome. It didn't last. Ptolemy XIV returned to Egypt in 55 BCE with Roman military support. Berenice resisted, but her defences crumbled. Her husband was killed in battle. She was captured and, like so many too independent royal daughters before and after, executed on the orders of her own father. Her crime? She ruled, boldly, publicly, on her own terms. In the decades that followed, her younger sister Cleopatra VII would take the stage, rewriting what it meant to be a queen in Egypt. But Berenice's story remained a quiet warning buried beneath pyramids and politics, a scandal not of sex but of sovereignty. She chose power, and history punished her for it. But while Berenice's reign ended with execution, her sister's life would burn across continents. Because Cleopatra didn't just challenge empires, she seduced them, and scandal became her empire. 26. Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. There are few names in history that shimmer with as much myth, scandal, and cinematic flourish as Cleopatra VII. She's been cast as a seductress, a manipulator, a political mastermind, a cultural icon, a goddess, and occasionally all of the above at once. but strip away the Roman propaganda and the centuries of dramatization, and what's left is perhaps even more scandalous. A woman who ruled unapologetically, made emperors kneel, and refused to perform femininity in any way that didn't serve her empire. Cleopatra came to the throne of Egypt at just 18, co-ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, because nothing says stable succession like marrying your preteen sibling and sharing power under threat of Roman intervention. But Cleopatra wasn't interested in being a ceremonial sister wife. She wanted control, and when that put her at odds with Ptolemy's advisors, she didn't blink. She fled, regrouped, and waited for her opening. It arrived in the form of a Roman civil war. Enter Julius Caesar. The meeting between Cleopatra and Caesar has been immortalized in art and fiction. She allegedly had herself smuggled into the palace wrapped in a rug, or more accurately, a sack of bedding to plead her case to the Roman general. The story is almost too poetic, which is why it has survived for so long. What's undeniable is that it worked. Caesar sided with her, helped defeat her brother's forces, and installed her as queen once more, this time with another younger brother as co-ruler, but in reality, she held the reins. Their alliance, political and personal, produced a child, Caesarion, and a wave of disapproval from the Roman Senate, who had not authorized their leading general to father kings abroad. Cleopatra, meanwhile, leaned into the optics. She presented herself as Isis incarnate, hosted Caesar in opulence, and visited Rome as a foreign queen, unafraid to tread where no Egyptian monarch had dared before. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra returned to Egypt and quickly entangled herself with another Roman, Mark Antony. Their relationship was both strategic and intensely scrutinized. To Antony, she offered ships, resources, and Eastern legitimacy. To Cleopatra, Antony offered continued protection and a counterweight to Caesar's heir, Octavian. But the public saw something far more theatrical. Two rulers cloistered in Alexandria, drinking, gambling, hosting lavish feasts, and referring to themselves as living gods. Rome, ever uncomfortable with powerful women, painted Cleopatra as the corrupter. She was the Eastern temptress, the serpent of the Nile, the destroyer of good Roman men. Never mind that Antony made his own choices, or that Cleopatra governed Egypt with more competence than most of her predecessors. The scandal was in her visibility. She didn't hide her power behind a curtain. She sat beside her lovers, wore crowns, minted coins with her image, and dared to name her. Son, King of Kings, it couldn't last. Octavian, later Augustus, declared war, not just on Antony, but on Cleopatra personally. She was defeated at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, and the following year she died in Alexandria. The details of her death, like much of her life, have been cloaked in legend. What remains clear is that she refused to be paraded in chains through Rome. Cleopatra's greatest scandal was not who she loved, but how she ruled. She blurred the lines between queen and deity, lover and leader, Egypt and Rome, and in doing so, she became unforgettable, not because she fell, but because she dared to rise in the first place. But while Cleopatra's name lit up empires, the queen who comes next left behind almost nothing except mystery. Her face vanished from walls, her legacy scraped from stone, and yet her legend whispers on. Nefertiti didn't court scandal, she disappeared into it. 27. Queen Nefertiti of Egypt. There are queens who scandalized their courts, and then there's Nefertiti, who scandalized an entire religion, vanished from history, and re-emerged thousands of years later as an icon with no script. She's the Mona Lisa of ancient Egypt, famously beautiful, eternally enigmatic, and never where you expect her to be. Nefertiti ruled during the 14th century BCE alongside Pharaoh Akhenaten in a time of monumental upheaval. Her name means the beautiful one has come, and if that sounds like something out of legend, so did her reign. She didn't just walk into the palace and play the dutiful wife, she helped turn Egypt's entire theological universe upside down. Under Akhenaten, the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods was abandoned in favor of one, Aten, the sun disk. Temples were closed, priests were dismissed. A new capital city, Akhetaten, now known as Amarna, was built in the middle of the desert, and in the center of this bold, controversial experiment stood Nefertiti, not as a background figure, but as a near equal. She appeared in art more frequently than any queen before her, sometimes shown leading ceremonies, wearing the blue crown reserved for pharaohs, even smiting enemies in the same posture as a king. To a society built on religious consistency and divine order, this wasn't just unusual, it was scandalous. Queens did not wear crowns, they did not offer sacrifices as priests, they certainly did not stand shoulder to shoulder with their husbands as if their bloodline carried the same authority. But Nefertiti did. Then, at the height of her influence, she vanished. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, her name disappears from inscriptions. Her images are removed from temple walls. Her titles are replaced. Some scholars believe she died. Others argue she changed her name and ruled as a pharaoh in disguise, possibly even as the mysterious Neferuaten, a shadowy ruler who reigned briefly before the rise of Tutankhamun. Whatever happened, her disappearance was anything but quiet. Temples were defaced, statues smashed, the capital was abandoned. Later pharaohs tried to erase the entire period from memory, calling Akhenaten a heretic and purging his name from royal lists. And Nefertiti? She became a blank space in history. It wasn't until 1912, with the discovery of her iconic limestone bust in Amarna, that the world remembered her face. The bust is now one of the most recognized images in archaeology, a queen staring serenely into eternity, her power frozen in high cheekbones and symmetry. But her story remains fragmented, pieced together from broken walls and conflicting theories. Was she a co-ruler, a usurper, a puppet, a pharaoh in her own right? The mystery endures because the scandal was never her actions, it was her silence. A queen whose legacy was deliberately erased, not because she failed, but because she might have succeeded too well. And as Egypt tried to forget her, Nefertiti became unforgettable. But where Nefertiti vanished into myth, the queen who comes next lived in the blur of folklore and whispered legend, not carved in stone, but passed through stories, tales of poison, affairs, and royal rebellion. Because Queen Devi, whoever she truly was, didn't need a crown to leave a mark. Just a little chaos. 28. Queen Devi and the Shadow Queens of Indian folklore. Unlike the marble-carved legacies of European queens or the papyrus-stained mythos of Egypt, many royal women in Indian history have survived not in scrolls or chronicles, but in song, rumour, and 1,000 versions of local folklore. These were not always queens in the traditional sense. Some were consorts, some warriors, some widows who never remarried, and some who remarried too quickly. The most elusive among them is Queen Devi, a name less tied to a single historical figure than to a collection of royal women whose stories have been passed down, embroidered with suspicion, admiration, and scandal in equal measure. The name Devi simply means goddess in Sanskrit, and over the centuries it has been attached to many queens across Indian dynasties, from the Maurya to the Gupta, from the Rajput courts of Rajasthan to the palaces of South India. And almost always, the name carries with it a complicated legacy. Women who stepped outside expected roles, who advised their husbands or disobeyed them, who loved too openly or plotted too quietly. Among the most prominent is Devi, the first wife of Emperor Ashoka. Yes, that Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor who went from ruthless conqueror to enlightened Buddhist monarch. Devi was reportedly a merchant's daughter, not royal by birth, and her marriage to Ashoka was politically inconvenient for the elite classes. She was beautiful, intelligent, and spiritual, encouraging her husband's conversion to Buddhism before it became a state policy. But her refusal to move to the imperial capital after Ashoka became emperor, and the court's refusal to acknowledge her as the empress left her sidelined, a footnote in the official records, but a figure of fascination in later texts. She faded into the background, but never quite disappeared. In Buddhist traditions, she is remembered as a woman of wisdom and dignity. In court gossip, she was seen as a consort who abandoned protocol, refused to submit, and quietly shaped the future of an empire from afar. Other Devis appear in Rajput ballads, queens whose names have been lost but whose stories have survived. Women who seduced rival kings to delay invasions, who poisoned their own kin to save kingdoms, or who took lovers and kept them disguised as wandering ascetics. In folklore, these queens are often simultaneously revered and reviled, seen as cunning, scandalous, loyal to their people, but not always to their husbands. One recurring motif is the queen who tests poison on herself, a legend often tied to royal women during times of succession crisis. One version tells of a queen who prepared herself slowly over months, ingesting small doses until she became immune. Then, when the king's enemies attempted to assassinate her through her food, she calmly consumed the meal and smiled. Surviving poison wasn't just a flex, it was a message. I know how the game is played, and I am not the pawn. These tales rarely made it into official chronicles, which preferred to keep their women either sainted or silent. But in the margins, in the temple carvings that show queens holding weapons, in the village songs that mention ladies with long hair and longer knives, and in the suspicious entries left by visiting envoys, we find evidence of their presence. What made these queens scandalous wasn't that they acted immorally by modern standards, it was that they acted at all. A royal woman in pre-modern India was expected to uphold chastity, piety, and silence. She was a symbol, not an agent. But these Devis were agents. They made decisions. They whispered strategies into royal ears. They defied the instructions of priests, broke alliances, and sometimes, even more offensively, fell in love with men they weren't assigned. And perhaps that's what makes the idea of Queen Devi so enduring. She's not just one woman. She's an archetype, a reflection of how female power in South Asia was tolerated only when it behaved like a goddess, not a human. But Devi, like her name, refused to be simplified. She was mother, wife, strategist, seductress, widow, and ruler, depending on which tale you believe and which poet you trust. But now we step from the world of folklore into the realm of fire and prophecy. Because if Queen Devi blurred the line between woman and myth, the queen who follows did the opposite. Jezebel didn't belong to any single nation. She belonged to every scandal ever written about power and womanhood. She wasn't just a queen in the Bible, she became the cautionary tale of all queens to follow. 29. Queen Jezebel. Few queens have been so thoroughly flattened into a symbol as Jezebel. The name alone, now a shorthand insult, synonymous with vanity, promiscuity, and unrepentant wickedness. But behind the sermon and the slur lies the story of a woman who dared to rule in her own right, defend her gods, and play politics like a king. Jezebel wasn't born a villain. She was made into one, by prophets, by priests, and by the men who wrote her story after she was gone. Her name appears in the Hebrew Bible, primarily in the books of Kings, where she is introduced as the foreign wife of King Ahab of Israel. A princess of Sidon, a Phoenician city-state along the Mediterranean coast, Jezebel came from a world that revered powerful goddesses like Astarte and Ishtar, divine figures of fertility, war, and sovereignty. In her homeland, women held religious authority, ruled as priestesses, and took part in statecraft without the same limitations placed upon them by the patriarchal societies of their neighbours. But when she married into the Israelite royal family, she didn't convert or conform. She brought her gods with her. That was her first scandal. Jezebel promoted the worship of Baal and Asherah, deities associated with the earth, storms, and fertility, and she did so not quietly, but publicly. This enraged the prophets of Yahweh, who saw her religious influence as nothing less than blasphemy. The resulting theological conflict turned her from a queen into an existential threat. But it wasn't just her faith that stirred outrage. It was her politics. Jezebel wasn't a passive royal consort. She acted as co-ruler, influencing policy, directing royal decrees, and protecting her supporters. She wielded her position with the authority of a monarch, not the softness of a symbolic wife. This was especially evident in the infamous story of Naboth's vineyard. According to the biblical account, King Ahab desired a vineyard owned by a man named Naboth. When Naboth refused to sell, Ahab sulked royally. Jezebel, ever the pragmatist, stepped in. She orchestrated a plan to accuse Naboth of blasphemy, have him tried, executed, and the land seized. Cold, calculated, effective, and perhaps not very different from the political maneuvers of her male counterparts, but coming from a queen, unforgivable. The prophet Elijah, voice of divine retribution, declared she would be eaten by dogs and her blood spilled on the land she defiled. Not a critique of policy, an annihilation of character. Jezebel became the original warning label. This is what happens when women wield power without permission. Her death, as recorded, is theatrical. After Ahab's death, Jezebel continued as Queen Mother, maintaining influence over her son's reign. But when Jehu, a military commander, launched a coup and entered the city, she did not run. Instead, she applied her makeup, arranged her hair, and faced him from a window. "Have you come in peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" she asked, referencing a previous usurper. Jehu responded by ordering her thrown from the window. Her blood splattered the walls, and dogs consumed her remains, a fulfillment of Elijah's prophecy and a fitting end for a woman already transformed into a metaphor. But here's the twist. We know nothing of Jezebel outside the Bible. No Phoenician record, no alternative chronicle, no inscription of her own voice survives. Everything we know comes from her enemies, which makes her story less a biography than a weapon, one that has been used for millennia to warn against women who refuse submission, especially foreign ones, especially powerful ones, especially those who speak with conviction and act without apology. Even her name became corrupted. Isabel, possibly derived from "Where is the prince?", a ritual cry to the god Baal, was twisted into a byword for shame. Jezebel became the woman you're not supposed to be. She became the justification for silencing outspoken queens, for vilifying foreign brides, for reducing nuanced political actors into caricatures of lust and cruelty. But what if Jezebel wasn't wicked? What if she was merely effective? Loyal to her gods, strategic in her alliances, ruthless in protecting her family's rule. That's the real scandal, that she might have been competent, not corrupt. And as her bones were left unnamed, the next queen's legacy would be no less contested. She ruled an island on the edge of empire, and when her land was swallowed by colonial ambition, she stood her ground, not with an army, but with a pen, a constitution, and a song. Because Queen Liliuokalani's scandal wasn't seduction or excess, it was resistance. 30. Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii. When the world thinks of royal scandal, it often imagines bedrooms and poison, jewels and whispered affairs. But the story of Queen Liliuokalani, the last sovereign monarch of Hawaii, offered something far more subversive. A woman who dared to write her own laws, compose her own songs, and mourn her kingdom not with rage, but with grace. Her scandal was not moral failure or personal indiscretion. It was her refusal to bow, politically, culturally, or spiritually, to the empire that came for her. Born in 1838 into the Hawaiian alii class, Liliuokalani was royalty from the start. Educated at the royal school, she was fluent in English and well-versed in Western music, philosophy, and law, but also deeply grounded in Hawaiian traditions, language, and culture. She wasn't a figurehead. She was a thinker, a writer, a composer, and, most dangerously to those watching from across the Pacific, an independent ruler. She ascended the throne in 1891 after the death of her brother, King Kalakaua. Her reign began with ceremony, but was immediately mired in crisis. At the heart of the political turmoil was the so-called Bayonet Constitution of 1887, a document her brother had been forced to sign under pressure from American and European business interests in Hawaii. This constitution stripped the monarchy of most of its powers and handed them to a legislature dominated by non-Hawaiian, mostly American landowners. It disenfranchised native Hawaiians and concentrated power in the hands of sugar barons and businessmen, men who spoke the language of commerce, not culture. Liliuokalani saw the injustice and intended to reverse it. In 1893, she drafted a new constitution, one that would restore executive powers to the monarchy and re-enfranchise the Hawaiian people. It was, in effect, a peaceful reclamation of sovereignty, a reassertion of the fact that Hawaii was not a plantation, it was a kingdom, and she, its rightful queen. This act of defiance was all it took. On January the 17th, 1893, a group of American and European residents, backed by US Marines stationed nearby, overthrew Liliuokalani's government. It was not a democratic movement, nor a grassroots uprising. It was a corporate coup, staged in the name of stability and progress, and disguised with flags. They formed a provisional government and declared the Queen deposed. Liliuokalani, facing potential bloodshed, surrendered under protest, believing that the US government, once informed, would rectify the injustice. It did not. Instead, her opponents moved to annex Hawaii. President Grover Cleveland initially condemned the coup, but his successor, William McKinley, supported the annexation, which was finalized in 1898. The scandal was sealed, not in a tabloid, but in a treaty. Still, Liliuokalani did not go quietly. She was placed under house arrest in Iolani Palace in 1895 after a failed counter-rebellion attempted to restore the monarchy. During this confinement, she composed some of her most powerful work, including Ke Aloha o Ka Haku, the Queen's Prayer, a haunting hymn of forgiveness, sorrow, and unbroken dignity. She also published Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen, a memoir that laid bare the political manipulation and cultural devastation inflicted by imperial forces. In its pages, she wrote not as a dethroned royal, but as a witness to a theft in broad daylight. And yet, even in this quiet resistance, there were whispers. Rumors that she had secret wealth hidden from the Republic, that she conspired with foreign powers, that she had grown irrational in her grief. None of these claims were substantiated. All of them served the same purpose, to turn a queen into a liability. Because a woman who refuses to accept erasure is always dangerous to the ones doing the erasing. Liliuokalani never regained her throne. She died in 1917, still beloved by her people and still dignified in defeat. Today, she is remembered not as a tragic figure, but as a national conscience. Statues bear her image, songs echo her melodies. Her name is spoken not in hushed tones, but with pride. Her scandal was not one of impropriety or indulgence. It was that she insisted Hawaii was not for sale, that the throne was not ornamental, that being queen meant more than ribbon cutting and portrait painting. It meant protecting her people, even when the empire came wrapped in law books and business suits instead of swords. And so, as we close this gallery of scandalous queens, let it be said, vulgarity, in its truest form, was never about impropriety. It was about power. And the women who dared to wield it on their own terms were never simply scandalous. They were unforgettable.